One thing you will discover when you get next to one another is everybody needs some elbow room, elbow room. It's nice when you're kinda cozy, but not when you're tangled nose to nosy. Oh, everybody needs some elbow, needs a little elbow room. That's how it was in the early days of the USA. The people kept coming to settle, though the East was the only place there was to go. The president was Thomas Jefferson. He made a deal.
If you haven't heard that term elbow room before, it means that you're feeling a little bit crowded. You need a little bit of room to put out those elbows. That's the way that the new country of the United States was feeling in the early 19th century. And that song, which I remember very well from when I was a kid in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, watching Schoolhouse Rock on Saturday morning in between cartoons. I learned so much from Schoolhouse Rock. If you haven't discovered these yet, I suggest you do. Hey everyone, it's Mr. Gabin once again, and this week we are looking at issue number 32 of Social Studies Weekly, and this is all about something called the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase is important because it really set the stage for the development of our country from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. And we'll talk about what the Louisiana Purchase is and the effects that it had on the growth of our nation. So let's get into it. Let's talk about some of our big ideas for the week. Whoa! Yeah. Manifest Destiny. This is the big idea. And as you can see here, in case you don't recognize them, Thomas Jefferson, our 3rd president, he's on the bottom left there. And the guy on the right there that you see, that is Napoleon Bonaparte. And he was the leader of France in the early 1800s. And Napoleon, most well known, other than from putting his hand in his shirt like that, was the French ruler who sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States. And we'll get into a lot of the details of how that happened and what this term manifest destiny means. In fact, let's go ahead and talk about that right now. So the Louisiana Purchase was something that happened in the early 1800s, really early 1800s. And it ended up doubling the size of the United States at the time. This wasn't too long after the American Revolution, really. It was a couple decades. And to be able to double the size of a new nation like that was so important to the growth of the United States. Another thing that the Louisiana Purchase did, which again also helped add to the growth of the United States, was it gave the United States control of the port of New Orleans, which is in Louisiana. And it's right at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And this is important because the Mississippi River was one of the main waterways on the continent, and it allowed shippers and traders to move their goods more easily and didn't have to worry about any foreign powers contesting their use of the Mississippi River. And this was just a tremendous boost to this young nation's economy. Next, we will also talk a lot about a couple of guys named Lewis and Clark, and they led a group called the Corps of Discovery. And this was an expedition following the Louisiana Purchase that really helped open the way for people to settle in this new territory. And again, this idea of manifest destiny. Let's talk about those two words for a second. The word manifest means something that is clear or obvious or unquestioned. And destiny means the same as fate, something that is definitely going to happen. So manifest destiny means that Americans felt at the time that this is something that was going to happen. And it was obvious that it should happen. It was their God-given right and duty to spread the American way of life across the continent, whatever the cost. And this eventually would lead to other territorial acquisitions that would help create the United States as we know it today. And you'll see those different territorial acquisitions on this map here. In 1783, you see in reddish, this was the United States at the time. And you can see over the course of about 50 or 60 years, All of the territories that would eventually become states in the United States were acquired. You see that Texas was annexed from Mexico in 1845. The Mexican Cession, which followed the Mexican American War, which we studied in fourth grade, of course. That's how California became a part of the United States. And in 1846, you see that what was called the Oregon Country was acquired from Great Britain. And this happened through something called the Oregon Treaty of 1846. And Great Britain basically decided to give up half of this territory in order to avoid war with the United States. And here are the article titles for this week. I'll let you go ahead and take a moment to read through those yourselves. Our first article this week is all about how the Louisiana Purchase came about. And basically, Thomas Jefferson, he was our third president, and I'm sure you remember, wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, one of the signers of the Constitution. He decided that the United States needed to buy the port of New Orleans to protect American shipping rights. France owned it at the time, as they owned the entire Louisiana territory, and had recently shut down the use of the Mississippi River to the United States. And so Jefferson decided to send a couple representatives to France. And initially, again, they were just going to buy the port of New Orleans, but France was in the middle of a war of their own with Great Britain. And it turned out that Napoleon Bonaparte decided to offer to sell the entire Louisiana territory. And Jefferson jumped at the chance, and he approved that sale, as you see, on October 20th, 1803. The Louisiana Purchase cost $15 million. And as I said earlier, it doubled the size of the United States. And it included land that later became all of these different states. There's 15 different states here. And the land from the Louisiana Purchase would eventually become these states. This article here is about a leader of the Cherokee American Indian tribe named Sequoyah, and he is most well known for creating the Cherokee language. At the time, the tribe did not have a written language, so he decided to make symbols that connected to each of the different sounds in his language so it could be read. Until now, spoken language and oral storytelling tradition was very common among the Cherokee and many other American Indian tribes. And what the creation of this language allowed them to do was to be able to record their history. And this would, of course, benefit their descendants as they could read and honor the history that came before them. Sequoyah was honored in many ways, as it says down there, including having Sequoyah National Park named after him. So even though it's spelled different, as you'll notice, it was actually named after him as a way to honor his contributions. Exploring the Louisiana Territory. This is our main article for the week, and you will read about how no one really knew much about the center of the continent. So the Louisiana Territory was largely unknown. So President Jefferson decided to send a couple of men here, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to explore this new land so that Americans could actually begin moving into this frontier and settling and building homes and starting businesses and building towns and everything that would come after. And Lewis and Clark, as they will forever be known to American history, they gathered a team, and this team became known as the Corps of Discovery. And they had several goals that they were trying to achieve as they went on their journey. They wanted to find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. They wanted to build relationships with all of the different American Indians that they would meet along the way. And they also wanted to gather and record information about what the soil was like and what the water was like, what kind of plants, animals were in the different areas, what the kind of weather patterns there were, insects, as much information as they could gather, really. Someone else that you will read about is an American Indian woman named Sacagawea. You may have heard that name. She has become a very famous figure in this on this journey. And she was the wife of a man named Toussaint Charbonneau. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that at least close to right. Lewis and Clark hired him to act as a guide and interpreter. But it ended up being Sacagawea who made this journey a lot easier for the Corps of Discovery. She helped them make friends with different American Indians. She translated Shoshone language into Hidatsa, another language, which was a language that her husband spoke. And he also spoke French, so he would translate it into French, but he did not speak English. Luckily, some of the members of the Corps of Discovery spoke French, so that was the way that they were able to communicate. So without Sacagawea, communication would have been largely impossible in many cases along this journey. A lot of artwork depicts Sacagawea as a guide for Lewis and Clark. You can see her here pointing. You can see her here pointing. And here she is pointing. And right here she's pointing. So it's clear that she has that reputation for, for guiding Lewis and Clark and having a big role in the success of this expedition. As you might imagine, this was not an easy trip. There were plenty of dangers and hardships that they faced along the way. They were often hungry. They were paddling boats along the Missouri River, similar to the one you saw on the previous slide. And on the map here, you can actually see them following on their initial route, following the Missouri River, and you'll see their return trip as well. And there was lots of sickness, there were injuries, rainstorms. It was super hot. It was super cold. There were mosquitoes. There were wild animals such as grizzly bears. So all in all, it was a very tough journey for them, but it really did turn out to be a very successful expedition. They returned in 1806 and they had achieved a lot of what they set out to achieve. They did not find a water route to the Pacific Ocean, but they did build plenty of relationships with different American Indian individuals and tribes that they met along the way. And they did gather a lot of scientific information about the area's soil and water, plants, animals, weather, and insects. Here we return to the concept of manifest destiny. And just to build off of what we talked about earlier, after the American Revolution, Americans were looking for ways to expand the country. And of course, this happened with the Louisiana Purchase and all of the other territorial acquisitions that we talked about earlier. And this built upon the original 13 colonies. We talked earlier about manifest destiny, how that it was a term that was used to describe what they felt, how it was their right, their God-given right and duty to spread the American way of life across the continent, whatever the cost. And I wanted to share this piece of art here. This is a very famous piece of art called American Progress. You can see that it was painted in 1872. So that was several decades, many decades actually, after the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition. And there's a lot going on in this painting that I want you to pay attention to. This is meant to be a symbol. It's meant to represent the concept of manifest destiny. You can see that everybody is moving west. There's trains moving west. There's people moving west, stagecoaches. The figure in the middle is an angel, also symbolizing the idea of progress, that is lighting the way for them. She's also just happens to be carrying telegraph wire as well. So what this painting is doing is visually portraying the process of American westward expansion, which ushered in a new era of modernization, development, advancement to the West. And the West itself, you can see, is being portrayed here as kind of a dark and a savage place. You see in the West, the direction everybody is going is very dark. So it's actually represented by darkness. And the area in the East is represented by lightness. But with the ushering in of all this new development, the indigenous people, the American Indians living in the West, and their way of life ends up being cast out. And this actually, some people question this goal. Was it really about spreading a good way of life, the American way, or was it more about spreading greed and controlling lands and people? And this is a discussion that continues to be worth having today. Here is an interesting culinary phenomenon I only found out about by reading this issue of Social Studies Weekly. This article is called Portable Soup, and it just talks about a means of sustenance that Lewis and Clark brought along on their journey that was basically a dried paste that they added to boiling water that was able to give them some good nutrition, but certainly not good taste. And as I say here at the bottom, they really only use this as a last resort if they were close to starving. This short article gives you a little bit more detail on some stuff that we've already talked about a lot in previous articles about essentially the benefits of the Louisiana Purchase. And not only did it double the size of this very young nation, but it gave the United States control of the port of New Orleans. And that meant that there were no other foreign countries that could block this very important shipping route. It also gave the country plenty of room, elbow room, if you will, to continue expanding into this great western frontier. And finally, this was land that was gained by purchase, not by war, so there were no American lives lost. And unfortunately, that couldn't be said for later land acquisitions, such as what was gained through the Mexican-American War. And to wrap things up this week, there is a short article called Explorers, which is about Lewis and Clark's expedition and focuses on the more scientific aspects of their journey, how they were asking lots of questions that scientists ask, such as how deep was the river, how fast was the current, how high were the cliffs, and so on. Basically anything that would lead them to some sort of discovery about the plants, animals, climate, and terrain of the Louisiana Territory. All right, I think that just about does it for this week. My usual reminders are here. Please make sure you're reading the assigned articles each day, and you are working on that Think and Review assignment throughout the week, a little bit each day as you finish the articles. Turn that in by Friday, please, and then also complete that test by Friday as well. This is Mr. Gabent signing off once again.
We'll find some elbow room up